He probably needs no introduction as she's a frequent flyer here. And now a member. As I mentioned, Judy's a former history teacher at Moorestown Friends School and now works as the archivist at Moorestown Friends. And is here to share some of her insights around Alice Paul.
Good morning. All right, so I want to just say a couple of things as we get started. I'm not going to talk about the part of Alice's life that most of you know about, the part where she comes back from England and becomes and changes the way in which the suffrage offers an alternative path to suffrage from the one that had been being tread before. I actually became, through my work at the archives, became very, very interested in how she became the person who came back to the United States. So this talk is actually going to concentrate on that earlier part of her life until she gets back from England, at which point she becomes actively involved in the American suffrage movement. So that's the part. I'm happy to answer other questions if they come up or anything like that. So, and that's why it says Becoming Alice Paul. Also, because I'm a historian, you will see a lot of quotes from her. And I just want to start out, just want to start out by saying that the core of the collection at Moorestown Friends School comes from the work of Margaret Barnes, now Margaret Mansfield, and an elective class in 1985-86, which talked to the person who did the oral interviews with Alice Paul that then allowed her to be rediscovered in the 80s. Prior to the 80s, people really didn't know who she was. The story of suffrage in this country, like many of our pieces of history, had become much more about the mainstream, and Alice was really not very well known. That might not be true here, but in the larger picture. Starting in the 80s, she becomes better known, and a lot of the work is based on interviews done by a woman named Amelia Fry, which we have both in hard copy and in and the tapes themselves. And so a lot of what I have here. The other place that this material is drawn from is her papers are collected at the Radcliffe Harvard Library. And it turns out, and I don't know why they're there and not at Swarthmore, don't ask me. But what is there, she was very careful about what she left behind. So it's almost all her letters to other people and things like that. But what was in there that I found so interesting was her college notebook from her freshman year, which you'll see quotes from, and also letters to people at home and things like that. So what's going to happen is my husband, Richard, is going to do the slides, and I'm going yeah, we're a real high-tech family here. He's going to hit the button, and I'm going to be talking. So there is stuff to read on the slides, but I'll be covering what it is. So if you can't actually read it, or if you need me to read it to you or something, you can raise your hands. But it's not a PowerPoint, it's illustrations. All right. Okay. I'm going to concentrate on how Alice became the Alice Paul that you know. And interestingly enough, when I started this work, I knew about her because, of course, at Moorestown Friends School, she's our most famous graduate. We have a lot of famous graduates, but she's sort of one of our most famous. And periodically, we reprise her in many ways at school. Lynn Brick used to dress up as her for special occasions, and so did some other people, and there are things for her hanging around the school and stuff, which you may or may not have seen. So, for those of us from Moorestown, Alice Paul is our hometown hero, and especially for those of us associated with Moorestown Monthly Meeting and MFS. While she did not attend meeting much after she finally left home, I discovered letters in the archives at Harvard, which indicate that she got a letter from Moorestown Monthly Meeting every year, reminding her that she was a member, and telling her how meeting was doing, and then inquiring as to how she was. There are no responses to these letters. And her financial records have not been digitized, because I did go to try and look if she actually gave us any money, but I could not determine that. However, for locals, and this may be true for several people in the room, She may have a rather tarnished glow. When there may be some of you who know someone or who your great aunts, your grandmothers met her when she returned to live at the Greenleaf in the 1970s. She wasn't really very popular, and people didn't have a lot of lovely things to say about her. The words most often used to describe her were arrogant, privileged, and difficult. And I'm sure there are people here who have heard those words about her. However, she remains one of the leading lights of the struggle for women's equality, first at the ballot box, later through, and then there are some things most of us know about the ballot box and the Equal Rights Amendment. But she remained active in the struggle for women's legal equality throughout her life. And so after the Second World War, she and the people she worked with, I'm going to talk about her. If this were a class, we would be talking about all the people, but I'm just going to talk about her. But you need to understand that she did none of this on her own. In good Quaker fashion, there was a large community of people working with her throughout most of this. It was she and the women she was working with internationally who got gender included in the Charter of the United Nations and also in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It would otherwise not have been in there. And that has actually set the stage for an enormous amount of change, or not, worldwide. One of the last things she managed to do was to get the word gender inserted into the 1964 Civil Rights Act. This actually set up to force the EEOC to deal with women's labor issues. This was a very controversial thing to do. And if you're interested in that, there's a lot to be read about that. She was a wonderful politician, and sometimes she would trade her. Sometimes she might walk a little close to a line, and there's every reason to believe that that was the case for that inclusion. But that inclusion actually has had a huge impact on women's work. They were not originally supposed to be included in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was supposed to be primarily about people of racial. All right. It should. All right. She used her commitment to equality of the sexes and her firm belief in the power of direct action to change the world and speak truth to power. It has to be acknowledged that the women's rights movement, like many other rights movements, has been entangled in a web of competing agendas around class, race, and privilege. Many of the well-known, and also that Alice was a woman of her time, and we cannot expect her to have the sentiments and beliefs and values that we may have in the 21st century. Many of the women that she worked with came from upper middle and upper class families, which meant white families, which meant that they grew up as Alice did with servants, educational possibilities, and many privileges. Her privilege made it possible for Alice to ignore issues around race because she did not understand the centrality of race in the US. Her focus was on legal equality for women, period. She assumed that such equality would include women of color. The 19th Amendment does state that women have the right to vote regardless of color, but we all know that Black women were not allowed to vote because of their race, and that in general, people of color in this country are still struggling for full equality. All right. So, as I did, I'm going to start the talk with contrasting two different things. I'm going to start with an article from 1919. This is the first primary source that I read when I was starting my work. It just happened to be the first piece of paper I came across. And it sparked in me this question of how did this sort of dichotomous portrait come to be? So this article is from 1919, which was the time of the Silent Sentinels and the picketing of the White House during World War I, which was highly controversial and very much disapproved of by almost everybody except Alice and the National Women's Party. And it was in a magazine called Everybody's Magazine, which was a popular sort of like home journal at the time. And the author came to Moorestown. The title of the article is What Hometown Thinks of Alice Paul. So again, with the prejudices of the time, the author, whose name was Anne Herndon, went around town asking people about Alice. And the first person she visited was a person named Mrs. L. And the author wants us to know that Mrs. L had just had her drawing room redone in velvet, and that she had 2 lovely children and a grand piano. Okay, we're talking classist here, so let's just, go to the wall with it. I'm sorry, it was wisteria velvet. Wisteria velvet is. Okay. The question of Alice, this is a quote, the question of Alice threw her into something bordering on a state of mind. She would have preferred talking of Mrs. Catt, who was the head of the mainstream and a National American Women's Suffrage Association. And she said, the National American Women Suffrage Association, which dates from the time of Susan B. Anthony, emphatically disapproves of Alice and her National Women's Party and their goings-on. We think Alice's picketing the White House and annoying the Senate is outrageous. When asked whether Alice's activities had affected her status in town, Mrs. L replied, Alice seldom comes home and is not the kind to care about card parties and dances. Her idea of a good time seems to be hunger striking in a dirty jail. The author goes on to talk, and I wish I knew which dear old Quaker lady this was who lived nearby, but she's not identified. But anyway, she goes to talk to a dear old Quaker lady a few blocks away who, quote, nearly wept at my mention of Alice. I cannot talk about it. It is too dreadful. Alice has chosen to fly in the face of her religion, which bids us be meek, and her country, which bids us to be law-abiding. But I am a friend of the family and cannot say a word. The author then, to finish off, goes to talk to Mrs. Paul and Alice's sister Helen, and to nobody's surprise finds that they are somewhat more supportive of Alice's activities. By the way, Mrs. L gets this much space, the old Quaker lady gets this much space, and Mrs. Alice, Tacy Paul and Helen Paul get about that much space, because the author didn't really want to hear what they had to say. But the article ends with Mrs. Paul quoting Alice's father. No, that's okay. You can leave it there. Alice's father to say, well, Mr. Paul used to say, if there was anything hard and disagreeable to be done, I bank on Alice. This contrasted with the description of her that comes out of the material of her time at Friends High School. Now, I'm sure most of you know this, but to be clear, when Alice was here, there were 2 high schools. That one over there, and that one over there was Orthodox, and the Pauls were Hicksites. And in fact, Alice said she doesn't think she ever spoke to an Orthodox Quaker. She also said she didn't know anybody who wasn't Quaker, i.e. Hicksite Quaker, except for the Irish maids. And they thought the Irish maids were very funny. Again, we're talking class and privilege here. There's just, there's no way around that. So the school that she actually went to was where the post office is now at 2nd and Chester. And there was Friends High School at 2nd and Chester and Moorestown Friends School here. And they got put together in the 1920s. I'm not actually going to talk about that. All right. But in the description, I'm going to talk more about her life at Moorestown what I'm going to call Moorestown Friends School. But please understand, we're talking 2nd and Chester in a little bit later. But what I came across when I started reading the material from her school days was that Alice was athletic, active, and when all the students then took their lunches in the classrooms, there was no cafeteria of any sort. And the comment made by an interviewee, a series of interviews were done by both Amelia Fry and the students here from Moorestown Friends School with residents in the Greenleaf in 1985-86, some of whom either had known Alice, who died in 77, or who knew people who had known Alice. So one of the interviewers said, Alice always seemed to be the center of the conversation. The other thing we need to be clear about with Alice is her grounding in her upbringing at the Society of Friends. The picture that's Tacy Perry Paul. Do we have any Perrys here? And she, with her mother at 6 months. You can change. Okay, whoops, back one, please. All right, so it was called Friends High School. I call it Moorestown Friends School. There were about 125 students when she started there. But before I get to that, I'm going to talk about the Paul family was and had been an active part of the Hicksite Friends community in Moorestown and surrounding towns, and Ms. Paul attended meeting with her family every week. Her mother, Tacey Paul, was an active supporter of local suffrage organizations. Alice grew up steeped in Friends' beliefs in equality and living one's faiths, as well as in modesty, meekness, and self-discipline. The modesty and self-discipline she's going to keep, the meekness she's going to kind of sweep away, as we saw to the distress of some of her older Quaker colleagues. As she recalled in her interview with Amelia Fry when discussing her experience with suffrage before she left the country. When I had gone to the suffrage meetings in this country, the US, there was no oppositions. Everybody was in accord. All the Quakers were in accord. This had been one of their principles since Quakerism was started, equality of the sexes. This is the only group I ever heard of that had it in their first principles, first enunciated back in 1684. It wasn't a subject for discussion. You just knew that there were many things in which the world hadn't come along, and this was one that had to come along sometime. So she was introduced to it, but she was not, in fact, it didn't call to her in her childhood. All right, you can stay there for just a minute. So she attended she attended Friends High School at 2nd at Chester. She was a good student and an active participant in the life of school. Great. So this is the graduating class in 1901. Alice is in, if you could pick her out, this is what it says. And when I went to actually go look at it, I'm not sure they identified it correctly, but I couldn't be sure. It's hard to tell. But in any case, this has Alice in it, her sister Helen, and her brother William all here. And that's the class. And go on. All right. And that's what the building looked like. This is from 1904, 3 years after Alice's graduation. All right. Okay. One more. Great. This is taken at the time she was attending, but actually, now that I'm looking at it, this is the Orthodox school. So this should not be here because Moorestown Friends Academy was the Orthodox school over there. So make it go away. Good. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about Alice and her friends. Lots of people thought Alice didn't have any friends, but when she was in high school, she actually did have quite a number of friends. So what we have here is a picture of her on the lawn at Paulsdale, and I'm pretty sure, I'm not entirely sure if Alice is actually, it's hard to tell, could be that person's Alice, but I'm not sure. But she's definitely in this one. She's sitting in the chair. So this is about 1900. This would have been her next to last year in high school when these were taken. All right. She participated in debate. When you were coming in, you saw something I just discovered in a completely different place. For whatever reason, school has preserved the minutes of the debate society from 1899 to 1901, written in absolutely beautiful copperplate of every meeting they had, what they did, and all their members. It was with the minutes of school committee. Nobody knows why, but it isn't there now. It's moved to the Alice Paul collection, which is probably where it should be. But it shows that she was both a member and participated in their debates, and they did structured debates, they did speeches. This was a very big deal in schools around this time, public speaking and that kind of thing. But she was also vice president. She participated in debate, clearly, played baseball, basketball, and field hockey. She gave the valedictory speech for her graduating class. In baseball, she was remembered by a former schoolmate as one of the best batters. And she was also a voracious reader. She played tennis at home, and to quote, she said, "And I read just endlessly, ceaselessly, almost every book, it seems. So we just read whatever books there were. And there was pretty nearly everything I can remember." So it's clear from her, and it'll be even clearer in college. This was your basic, well brought up, upper middle class, Quaker girl who was going to go on to do something, but you would not necessarily have predicted that she would go on to be the person she became. She was, and you'll see that even more in her college years. She's just a kid doing kid things. All right. She graduates in 1901. Can you go back? There we go. Graduates in 1901. We're very proud to have this. You've probably seen it. If you go over to school, you've seen it hanging. We actually have an official letter that says, Alice Paul Institute says we're allowed to keep it. I don't know if they want it back or not. But we have an official letter, officially. All right, you can go on next. So the next couple of things you're going to see are from her notebooks. This actually is, I just put it in because I was so impressed by it. She kept a diary, and the diary doesn't tell you how she felt about anything. It just tells you what she did. Anything that about how Alice felt about things, she pretty much kept to herself. Even in her letters, it's pretty much this happened, this happened, this happened, and this happened. So this is a sketch from one of her classes. It's clearly Greece. So maybe it was, I like to think it's ancient Greece. I like to think that maybe it was an ancient history class. Hopeful. I like to hope. And, but I was sort of way impressed. I mean, no time in my life could I make a map that good, you know? So, and we can go on to the next, please. All right, so what you're looking at here and what I'm going to talk about next, she said, this is a quote from her, "Everything that happened, I took part in or tried to at Swarthmore." This is an example of her handwriting. This is from her diary. That's a ticket to one of the football games she went to. Swarthmore had a football team then. I'm not sure how good a football team it was, but they had one. And it says, Thursday, October 11th, played dodgeball in the afternoon. In the evening, N. Bloom, E. somebody, McCraig, and worked chemistry at blah, 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 and then the next day. So that's typical of what her diary looks like. It's not going to tell you much about how she felt. It's really just, I did this, I did this, I did this. So you could just leave it there for a moment. After graduation, she went to Swarthmore, where her mother had attended and which had been founded by members of her family earlier in the decade, in the century before. At Swarthmore, she continued to have an active academic life. She even got herself in trouble. But I'm going to talk more about that a little bit later. This is a quality about Alice that stayed with her until she became so consumed by her, it actually stayed with her whole life. She said when she went to Swarthmore, "The one thing I don't know anything about are all the things in the field of science. So I decided to make biology my major. I thought, this is the only way I will learn about biology." So she became a biology major. And you will see throughout her life, she never stops going to school. She ends up actually with a PhD and a law degree while she's doing everything else, because she's always convinced, and I'll quote her several different times, that she doesn't know enough. She was very much committed to the confluence of the practical and the informational or academic. All right. That's okay. Great. All right. She describes going to an alumni football game with her friend Rena, her brother, and her brother's friend, and on to a feast afterwards. The college won. The next morning, she slept late and hardly had time to get to meeting. By the way, she got in a little trouble for skipping meeting every once in a while. Not her thing, apparently. Another day, she played dodgeball in the afternoon, and in the evening worked on her chemistry. You can, please. All right. Her father dies in the middle of her freshman year. In the middle of her freshman year. This puts a strain on the family. It doesn't really cause financial hardship of any kind. They were relatively well off and they had the farm, and so I saw no evidence of that, but it did disrupt the family. And he was much beloved by Alice and much beloved by his wife. Go ahead, please. Great. Okay. So she carefully saved this letter, and I know it's hard to read, so, but at the end of her freshman year, she receives a letter of rebuke sent to her mother requesting that her social activities be restricted to only those approved by the college faculty, and that she not be allowed to go to the theater in Philadelphia with boys from the college. That's what this says, and in the end it says, esteemed friend, and it says, the last paragraph is, it is earnestly advised that dress for college shall be kept simple and modest and inexpensive. Sincerely thine. Alice Paul was just a little bit of a fashionista. Not a lot. She was very frugal, but she did like to have her clothes sort of at least in keeping with the fashion of the time. Again, she doesn't do much of this once she, goes full throttle into it, but she did. So the note goes home to her mother to say, yeah, don't do it. In her junior year, her cousin Susan Perry and I'm going to get this name wrong if I don't look at it. Sorry about this. A Lippincott, and I will get the first name of the proper Lippincott in a moment. Go to Swarthmore, as they were expected to do, and Alice teaches them to waltz and do the two-step. Clearly, we have a lovely young lady. She's also very active in the athletics. She plays field hockey. She's on the debate team. She continues that very active athletic and academic life. She also gets in trouble because of her absences. Not necessarily for meetings. She never quite got caught for that, but she does get a letter which says, "The following absences have been noticed against thee for the week ending." And that's her freshman year, 11/23/1901. Yeah, and she didn't have any excuses either, so. All right. Let me see. Okay, this is Alice in 1905 after she graduates. All right. As a senior at Swarthmore, she ends up taking a class that's going to sort of we don't really know. She struggled in her math classes and she struggled in her science classes. So she ends up taking a class in political science and economics. And as she says, and immediately I seemed to have great joy in them. The professor, whose name was Robert C. Brooks, emphasized combining political work and social activism to effect change. And he recommends Alice Paul for a scholarship, sort of a scholarship, to go and to work in a settlement house in New York for a year and be paid. And I'm going to talk more about settlement, just to be clear with you all. And Alice, at this point in her life, when she's graduating Swarthmore, it was a very accepted thing for young women of progressive families to go into the settlement house movement to try and make the world better. Or either that or teaching were two very respectable things for people to do. And it began to look like Alice was going to follow that path. All right. Okay, this is her graduation class. Okay, we're going to stop here for a moment. All right. All right. She spent the summer after graduation working in New York at one of the New York City settlement houses. The settlement houses provided education, ESL, practical classes, and help with housing, jobs, and health, et cetera, to the new immigrants and the less economically well-off people in New York in the tenement areas, all over New York. They also provided activities that stressed American ideas, such as bobbing for apples on Halloween, as illustrated in this picture from 1905. Remember how I said earlier, I hope I said this, that even though they meant well, the people who tried to help did not take the cultures and belief systems of the people they were trying to help very seriously. Alice, who understood this was a mistake, by the way, tells a very interesting story about many of the clients at her settlement house were Jewish, and they wanted to take them to Broadway. But they decided to take them to Broadway on Friday night. And Alice said, and of course in 1900 and 1905, there were no Reform Jews. There were just observant Jews, or non-observant Jews, I suppose, maybe. In any case, Alice said, maybe not, Friday night? No, Friday night. Well, pretty much nobody came. And Alice's comment was, really, they shouldn't have done it on Friday night. But that speaks to the way in which these people who did a great deal of good, the settlement houses did enormous amounts of good and eased the transition into American society and American work for many people. There was that inherent early 20th, late 19th century thing about, well, America's best. Oh, wait, maybe we're hearing that now. Oh, well. All right. So while she was at the settlement house, she ran the sewing club, and the comment was that she probably learned more about sewing from the people who came than she taught them. But she also ran the gymnasium, which she would have been fabulous at. She also, true to who she was, Alice also went to lectures at what would become the Columbia School of Social Work and even wrote a thesis there, although she didn't take a degree. And her quote about it was just a marvelous experience. I was assistant to an exceedingly experienced social worker, and I just went to this family and that family and the other family to see what their troubles were. After her residence in New York City in 1906, she returns to Moorestown, and she goes to the University of Pennsylvania to get her master's in sociology. And I will quote her when she says, "Then I decided I didn't know very much. I was thoroughly convinced of that. I learned enough to know that I didn't know anything about this field, the political and economic field. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania and enrolled as a graduate student." And this part of Alice's character, everybody should recognize if you've done any reading about her, just this notion of, okay, I'm going to go do this. I'm going to grad school. I'm going here. I'm going there. And she just sort of walked off to do it with that conviction that I believe came from being raised in her family and faith that, okay, it's just going to work out. All right. At the end of the year, she was given a scholarship to, I think you can change. She was given a scholarship to the Woodbrook Study Center, which had been founded in 1903 by the Cadburys and other English Quakers. Some of you know it well, to foster a vital friends ministry. She leaves on the day of commencement. She does not go to her commencement from Swarthmore. She gets on a boat and off she goes to go take up residence at Woodbrook, except she did the thing she did throughout her time in Europe. She decided, well, school doesn't start till the fall, so I'm going to go traveling. So she went to Germany, the Netherlands, France, stayed there for a minute. Yeah, okay. And traveled. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. And so she ends up at Woodbrook, which is outside Birmingham. This is a picture of students. I don't have a date on this. This is a Google search picture. So I don't have a proper reference for it. I'm sorry. And I don't have an actual date. It actually comes from one of the museums in Birmingham. But anyway, and one of the things to notice is Woodbrook took people from all over the world. Not just English people, not just American people, but Europeans. There were people there from India. There were even people during her time from Africa. So it was quite international at a time when that was not so common. All right. Nope, go back. And back one more. No, hold on that. Okay, we'll hold on this one for a minute. All right. So her comment on Woodbrook. Somebody will tell me if I'm running over time, please. So, because I can speed this up a little bit. She said it was an absolutely wonderful, wonderful place, and she couldn't say enough about it. It's while she's at Woodbrook that she gets introduced to Christabel Pankhurst. She was taking classes at the University of Birmingham. She was taking her classes at Woodbrook, and at the University of Birmingham was going to have a speech by Christabel Pankhurst, who was the daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, the mother. So there's the very famous Pankhurst suffragists in England. But the first speech doesn't go so well, so I'm going to read a quote for you. I wanted very much to go to this speech, so I went to this public meeting, after school hours, you see. It was Christabel Pankhurst. I don't know that I ever heard her name before. She was the principal speaker. Quite an entrancing and delightful person. Really very beautiful, I thought. So she started to speak, and the students started to yell and shout. I don't believe anybody heard one word that Christabel said, so she kept on anyway for the whole speech. She was completely shouted down. However, the president of the university was so upset at how she'd been treated, he asked her to come back and give her speech in a quieter environment. And Alice also attended. And at the end of that speech, and these quotes are from her, this is how she remembers things in 1970, in like 1975, early 70s. So, we all know how fallible memory is. So, and also she's coloring it to what she wants people to know about her. So, all right. She said after listening to the speech, if you feel some group that's your group, is the underdog you want to try to help. Is the underdog. You want to try to help. But here, when I saw this outbreak of hostility, I thought, this is one group now. I want to throw in all the strength I can give to help. And indeed, that's what she's going to do. She's going to become very actively involved in, one more. She's also, by the way, doing more settlement work while she's in England. She never stops doing things. This is from there, and okay. She gets herself a job in London working in settlement, and she decides to go touring around Europe. This is not Alice. This is as close as I could get. And the young woman she's traveling with goes by train, but Alice goes by bicycle. So Alice is bicycle touring Europe in about 1908. And when she was asked about it, she said, she answered, well, when Amelia Fry asked if it was unusual to go on a bicycling trip, Alice answered, if it was, it didn't seem to me unusual. It seemed to me a very normal thing. I have to say, I tried to check on this. I don't think it really was that normal for young women, particularly upper middle class young women, to go bicycling all over Europe. But there she went. All right. She goes up to London. And in London, while she's doing her work with a different settlement house, again, she's still on that path to go and be part of the settlement movement, she meets some people who volunteer her. She meets some people who tell her about the procession, and she goes to the procession. And this is one of the biggest processions. This predates, the British suffragettes were doing this before Alice brings it back to the United States. She joins this, and then, and you can leave it here. You can leave it here for a moment. And then she decides it's time to join. I'm sorry, was that a question? Okay. She decides it's time to join the group. So she says, I became a member of the Women's Social and Political Union. You become a member by signing an application blank and giving 25 cents. I can still remember my thrill at getting a letter from Mrs. Mabel Took, the national treasurer, I think she was, of the organization. A beautiful letter welcoming me into their ranks and thanking me for my 25 cents. I was so extremely happy to be really part of it. I went to all their meetings. Once she starts attending the meetings, she slowly gets more and more and more involved. And I want to read, she's also, by the way, going to the London School of Economics while she's doing this, working at the settlement house, active in the suffrage movement, standing on the street corner. Can you go in the next one, please? Yeah. So she goes in with her friend Rachel Barrett, and the first thing she does is she sells this, or gives away this magazine. And let me just see. So I want to read this small quote because I think it sort of encapsulates this. When she's doing that, she says, I remember how very bold and good Rachel was, and how very timid and unsuccessful I was, standing beside her trying to ask people to buy votes for women. So contrary to my nature, really, I didn't seem to be very brave by nature. I remember very well doing this day after day after day, going down, and we would just stand there and sell them. And I think it's interesting because that's not how we see her at all, but that was certainly how she saw herself. Finally, she becomes deeply involved with the Pankers, and she receives a letter and asking her to participate in actually one of their actions where they go to talk to the Prime Minister. And and this is what she has to say about it. It was to be on a certain day, to be led by Mrs. Pankhurst, and it would probably mean that you would be under some danger of being arrested and imprisoned. So you must not accept this invitation unless you were willing to do this. I remember hesitating the longest time and writing the letter and not being able to get enough courage to post it and going up and walking around the post office, wondering whether I dare put this in. I thought maybe I could go under an assumed name, as some of the people were doing, because while I didn't object to going at all, I thought all my family and everybody I knew would object. So to save them from the terrible disgrace and the blot on our family escutcheon and so on, I thought, well, I will go under an assumed name. And finally I decided I wouldn't do that. So at last I got up enough courage to post my letter saying I would go. And it is with that Alice begins what she will carry over to the United States, which is the active participation. In England, she goes to jail twice. It's the first time she's force-fed. This is from a letter describing what happened to her. The first time she was force-fed. And this is more of that same letter. And that's Hallowell Prison. You can stay there for a minute. Go back. This is Hallowell Prison where she was kept. And this is an article from an American paper about Alice Paul, who they say invented the hunger strike. That's not really the case. All right, next, please. This is her arrest record. And in the end, this is what she said. It was one thing that had to be done. I guess that's how I thought. And by the time she sailed for home, she had become what she had earlier claimed, that the suffragist movement had anyway one heart and soul convert. I don't know how many others they had. That was myself, and that was all there was to it. She sailed for home. She was very ill. She arrived home. She got better, and she went to work. And within a year, she had founded the National Women's Party and moved to the more radical approach, always nonviolent, but radical approach that she took to suffrage. Thanks. That wasn't too long.
I'm hoping there's going to be a sequel that's like Being Alice Paul. Starts here and takes us through the rest of her life.
I could do that. Yes, I think that would be. I could do that. Any questions? Anybody have questions? I hope you learned something about her. This is not the part of her life that most people know a great deal about, because the focus has been on her more radical activities. I think particularly in a time like this, I'll speak personally for a moment, when we may feel so many challenges, it's interesting to think about how it is that a perfectly ordinary person, not ordinary, but an ordinary person of her class and time, ends up becoming extraordinary. And I like to believe, I always did believe about my students, that they all have something extraordinary within them. As I used to say to them all the time, if they didn't, they wouldn't be my students. So the fact that they are means they must. Any more questions, anything? And I'm going to give all of this to both a copy of my talk, properly edited, and the slides will be available. Barbara? Yes. Adrian, was that a question? No, that's fine. Gosh, I don't know whether it's a good sign or not that there aren't any questions. Anyway, thank you all very much.